In the heart of bustling early 20th century New York, where the dreams of immigrants merged with the relentless hum of industrial progress, stood a building that would become both a symbol of hope and a crucible of tragedy. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory held within its walls the stories of countless young women who sought a better life in the land of opportunity. But underneath the rhythmic clatter of rows of sewing machines, the factory held deadly secrets. The Triangle Waist Company occupied the top 3 floors of the 10-story ash building in the Greenwich Village neighborhood in New York City. It was considered modern compared to many other factories during this time. The machinery was new, the workrooms well lit, and the building it occupied was less than a decade old. But it was not without failings. The ash building was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, but subcontractors employed the workers. Blank and Harris claimed to never know the rates paid to the workers within their walls or the number of people employed at the factory. The system was common at the time and rife with exploitation. 500 workers, mostly young immigrant women and girls, produced the Triangle Waist Company's women's blouses, known as shirtwaists. They typically worked close to 60 hours, earning between $7 and $12 a week. The factory comprised some 27,000 square feet of workspace, where employees worked in overcrowded rooms. Sewing machines were fitted onto long rows of tables, and heaps of discarded fabric littered the floor. Employees were expected to work nearly non-stop during their 13-hour shifts, with managers discouraging them from taking even bathroom breaks. The exit doors were locked to prevent unsanctioned breaks and theft of material, though this was common practice at the time. Also common was that the factory lacked a fire protection sprinkler system, and emergency procedures like fire drills were non-existent. The only protection against conflagrations was water pails hung along the walls, and while there was a fire escape, there was only one, and this led to an internal courtyard. Triangle workers went on strike in late 1909, the walkout expanding to an uprising of 20,000 workers. The employees demanded better pay, a 52-hour work week, and protections against unemployment during seasonal apparel changes. Blank and Harris were notoriously anti-union, known for using violence and intimidation to stop workers from forming one. The strike forced the men into giving workers a modest raise, but they refused to make the factory a closed shop that would employ only union members. With such immediate and pressing needs like compensation and reasonable working hours, the strikers elected not to push harder for long-term reform on things like improved safety. While these may have seemed like a step too far, the need for safer working conditions would soon become tragically apparent. On Saturday, March 25, 1911, the 500 or so workers inside the factory were preparing for the end of their shift when a fire broke out in a scrap bin under a cutter's table on the 8th floor around 4:40 p.m. The oily floors, along with the piles of highly flammable fabric atop workspaces, helped the fire spread at an alarming rate. While a bookkeeper on the 8th floor was able to phone up to the 10th floor to warn those there, there was apparently no such system in place to contact those on the 9th floor, and no audible alarm system. Workers on that level only learned of the fire when it arrived around them in scorching fury. Terrified workers trying to escape were met with obstacles at every turn. The long rows of work tables made it difficult for frantic women to reach exits, and 2 freight elevators soon became crammed full of panicked people trying to make their way out of the building. Many managed to escape using a staircase that led to an exit on Green Street, though the fire soon made escaping to lower floors impossible, forcing workers and the factory owners Blank and Harris onto the roof while the building beneath their feet burned. The entrance to a separate staircase that led to Washington Place was locked shut, the key holder having already fled the unfolding disaster. While some were able to make it to safety using the one actual fire escape, its poor construction along with heat from the fire soon led to it failing, sending 20 people plummeting 30 meters to their deaths. On the street below, New Yorkers quickly took notice of the screams coming from the top of the ash building, and flames began to lick the windowsills. A patrolman spurred his horse toward help. A doctor saw the commotion from his doorstep and grabbed his medical bag before running toward the blaze. A United Press reporter named William Shepard happened to be in Washington Square. He found a phone booth and gave a telegraph operator a live account of the horror unfolding before his eyes. Through the clouds of smoke billowing from the windows of the upper floors appeared what seemed to be bundles of clothes springing from the building and falling to the ground below. One passerby joked that someone was trying to save the best fabric, but as spectators drew closer, the true horror of the situation quickly became apparent. Bodies littered the ground around the building as the women of the Triangle Factory threw themselves from the windows to avoid being burned alive. Shepard reported seeing young women balancing on the windowsills as the crowd below begged them not to jump as they could hear the fire engines approaching. When the firemen arrived, some began to raise a ladder, while others took out a life net to catch the falling women. Shepard reported, quote, "The firemen held it under them. The bodies broke it. The grotesque simile of a dog jumping through a hoop struck me. Before they could move the net, another girl's body flashed through it. The thuds were just as loud. It seemed as if there had been no net there. It seemed to me that the thuds were so loud that they might have been heard all over the city." End quote. He watched as a man helped woman after woman step from the window and into the air as calmly and chivalrously as if he were passing them into a carriage. The last woman he embraced and kissed fiercely before lifting her and letting her go. Then, his coattails ablaze, he stepped into the air, following his love into death. The fire ladders crept upwards as the crowd below screamed for the firefighters to move faster and go higher. Then, to everyone's horror, the ladders juddered to a stop. They reached only as far as the 6th floor. Less than 10 minutes after the fire had started, the 9th floor windows were so jammed with workers trying to jump that they fell together in clumps. A heartbreaking fight to die on the sidewalk below instead of inside the inferno. The firefighters aimed their hoses at the wall above the windows, hoping to cool the scorching heat enough to reassure those inside that help was here. The water that ran into the gutter was stained red with blood. It took firefighters 30 minutes to extinguish the flames. By then, officers were already tagging the wrists of the workers piled on the sidewalk with numbers. Injured survivors were rushed to nearby homes and businesses. Others wandered numbly home or watched in shock as the unenviable task of moving the bodies began. The factory floors survived, but were filled with charred remains and debris. 146 of the 500 employees at the Triangle Waste Company were dead. The youngest victim was just 14, and the oldest was only 43. Most were young Italian and Jewish women, many of whom had been in the country less than a year. In the following days, the bodies were slowly identified, and the scale of the horror unfolded in the grieving city. Mothers and daughters, brides-to-be, sisters and brothers, friends who had clung to each other in their first days in America as fiercely as they clung to each other in their final moments of life. All died in a gruesome tragedy that could have been so easily avoided if the factory owners valued human life as much as they did profits. Just 2 years before the devastating fire, Blank and Harris had added to its insurance coverage. A fire prevention expert from Columbia University had been commissioned to inspect the factory. His report revealed he was deeply concerned about the crowded conditions on the top 3 floors. He noted that the employees would surely panic in a fire without proper training. He also expressed the danger of locking stairway doors and suggested that management establish fire plans and regular drills. The inspector notified another fire prevention expert in the city who offered to assist, but the Triangle owners never responded to his letters. Had Blank and Harris heeded the inspector's advice, the fire would likely have been extinguished before a single life was claimed. The fire sparked a rallying cry for political change, with Labour leader Rose Schneiderman delivering an electrifying speech about the tragedy. She pointed out that Triangle was not the first factory where women were burned alive. 4 months earlier, a factory fire in Newark, New Jersey, killed 25 workers. 6 had died in the flames, and the remaining 19 had jumped to their death. The fire chief in New York City was so shocked that he issued a warning saying that a deadly fire equal to Newark's was imminent. A professor at New York University read the chief's warning and wrote a letter to the city building department expressing his concern about the crowded and dangerous conditions he could see across the yard from his classroom window. The classroom was located directly across from the Ash building, where the Triangle Waste Company was housed. Also, following the Newark fire, a representative from the Women's Trade Union League was assigned to study the disaster and deliver a set of conclusions and recommendations. Her testimony at the grand jury trial struck Alderman Ralph Folks so powerfully that he introduced a resolution calling for the superintendent of the building department to investigate and determine if additional legislation was needed to protect factory workers in New York. His resolution was passed, but an investigation was never started. In the crush of public outrage following the Triangle fire, Blank and Harris were indicted on first and second-degree manslaughter charges. The owner's attorneys effectively convinced the jury that statements from survivors had been memorized and established reasonable doubt that the men had known about the locked doors at the time of the fire. New York building codes were also on their side. At the time, there were very few rules about the use of high-rise buildings. Ultimately, the jury acquitted both men of manslaughter, though they were found liable in a wrongful death lawsuit in 1913. The Triangle owners were ordered to pay compensation of $75 per casualty. It was hardly a drop in the bucket for Blank and Harris, who had been paid $60,000 more than the reported losses by their insurance company, roughly about $400 per casualty. So, in actuality, the factory owners had, in fact, profited from the horrific tragedy. After the Triangle factory fire, New York and other cities across the country passed new legislation regulating and safeguarding employees. The Factory Investigating Commission was created shortly after the fire and, in less than 6 months, had proposed 15 new laws for fire safety, inspection, employment, and sanitation. The tragedy sparked significant change not just in New York, but throughout the US, eventually resulting in safer working conditions for millions of people. After the fire, Blank and Harris struggled to regain a foothold in the garment industry. They opened a new factory, but it was not as successful. Though thousands of New Yorkers were impacted by the trauma of the Triangle fire and struggled to cope with the lasting images of flaming bodies jumping toward the sweet relief of death that met them on the pavement 80 feet below, the factory owners showed little empathy. In 1913, Blank was arrested for locking an exit door during working hours at the new factory. A year later, both men were caught sewing counterfeit National Consumer League anti-sweatshop labels into their garments. Though they never regained the success they had found in the Triangle Waist Company, Harris and Blank were never held responsible for the horrors that unfolded inside their factory. The 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire remained the single deadliest workplace tragedy in New York history for 90 years, until the terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center in 2001. The event remains a somber reminder of the cost of unchecked greed. The lives lost that day served as a catalyst for change, igniting a fervent movement that demanded responsibility and respect for human lives. The former factory, now called the Brown Building, still stands today. It is owned now by New York University, and students attend class in the same rooms that once claimed so many lives. As the years have passed, the Triangle Factory fire's legacy has endured, inspiring new generations to stand up against injustice and ensure that the unwilling sacrifices made in that fiery crucible were not in vain. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."